Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. What does it mean, politically, if you believe that the world is going to end, and soon? How does that affect your politics, your loyalty or lack thereof to the powers that be in your age? And what does that mean for the politics of everyone around you? How do you practice politics in an age when many people around you believe that the end is close at hand? This is a theme I've talked a lot about on the podcast, both with guests and in some of my own episodes. Essentially, how do our ideas about politics relate to our ideas about time? Political orders draw legitimacy from the past, from a constitutional moment, a lineage or a tradition in which they place themselves. But they're also about our ideas of the future. Do we imagine a gradual improving of society? Do we imagine an underlying social order to which we stray from and then return? Or do we imagine a radical break or disjuncture? For different people, it's different, right? And how do they talk to each other? How does someone who imagines a continual slow progress, or even no pattern at all, the world proceeding without rhyme or reason, how does that person talk to someone who not only thinks a radical disjuncture is possible, but that it's inevitable and imminent? How does that conversation go? That, essentially, is what this episode is about. My guest today is Professor Alison McQueen. She's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and History at Stanford University, and her research focuses on early modern political theory and the history of international relations thought. Specifically, we're going to be looking at her book Political Realism in Apocalyptic Times, which is exactly what I just described. How do people who have a realist disposition or orientation towards politics exist in society with people who are apocalypticists? How does that conversation go, and how do they impact and influence one another? I really enjoyed reading this book. It's about a number of thinkers I'm really interested in. For instance, Paul, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and bits of history that I find really fascinating. But it's also about themes and ideas that I think are relevant in the modern day. And I talk at the very end of this interview about how the book impacted me and how it spoke to me about our current political moment and what my takeaways from it were that sort of went beyond merely just the thinkers studied to the overall themes and ideas that Alison extrapolates from them. So I got a lot out of the book, a lot out of the conversation, and as you'll hear, this is all just stuff that really interests me and I really find fascinating, so I hope you do too. So, let's get straight to the interview. This is Realism and Apocalyptcism with Alison McQueen. I am joined today by Professor Alison McQueen. Alison, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So just to get started, if you're at a party and sort of asked what you do, or say an academic party where people would sort of know the various disciplines, what do you do and what are some of the things you like to write and read and teach and think about?
Well, I would say I'm primarily a historian of political thought. In the United States, we tend to think of that as a subcategory of political theorist. And so what I tell people at a party is I think a lot about what people thought about politics a long time ago, with a focus on what we call early modernity. And I delve a lot into thinkers like Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. And I would also say that within that, what I'm interested in is the connection between political thought and religious thought, which for thinkers in early modernity were very much intertwined.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that. So I've just read your work. It's actually been on my reading list for some time because I've been interested in political apocalypticism for some time and the connections between political and religious apocalypses. Your work, Political Realism in Apocalyptic Time, in Apocalyptic Times. To start with, you put in contrast or in tension with apocalypticism a tradition called political realism, with the proviso that with any political tradition, you're not going to get an exact definition. What would you say are the broad themes that characterize political realism for you?
I would say that political realism, you're right, it's a sort of umbrella term for a bunch of approaches to politics that share some distinctive features. And I would say there are four main features we would want to focus on. Realists tend first to acknowledge the distinctiveness of politics. Some of them will even make a stronger claim about the autonomy of politics. That may be a word, or the autonomy of the political, a term that your listeners will have heard before. And what they generally are saying there is it's a claim about the relationship between ethics and politics, that politics is not a realm where we just take the ethical standards that apply in our interpersonal relations and then apply them to politics. They may think politics is distinctive because it's an amoral realm. They may think it's distinctive because it's a realm with its own morality, or you'll sometimes hear it said as a distinctively political normativity. Or they may think it's a realm where we're still talking in terms of conventional interpersonal morality, but politics is simply a space where we more regularly have to violate the demands of conventional morality. So there's the distinctiveness of politics. And we see that certainly in Machiavelli, who I know we're going to talk about, when he says things like, rulers must not depart from the good when possible, but they must know how to enter into evil when necessary. So the distinctiveness of politics is the first claim that realists tend to share. A second is about the nature of politics, that politics is conflictual. You'll sometimes hear it expressed that politics is agonistic. There are various reasons why realists might think that. They might think that politics is governed by human passions and the power of reason is limited. They might think politics is conflictual because of the competing identities and interests involved in politics. They might think it's conflictual just because of the mere fact of value pluralism, along the lines of a kind of Isaiah Berlin sort of reading. So that's the second claim. Politics is conflictual or agonistic. A third is that realists tend to prioritize order and stability over the demands of justice. And the reason for that is they tend to think order and stability are fragile accomplishments. So you might think of someone like Thomas Hobbes as having that view, right? A natural view for someone to have when they've seen their country descend into civil war. And so you see contemporary philosophers talk about this. Bernard Williams talks about these problems of order as the first political question, right? The question you have to solve before you get to the other questions about justice and freedom and equality. And finally, political realists tend to reject as moralistic or utopian other approaches that seem to deny these basic facts about politics. And so you'll often see realists take aim at other schools of thought that in their view fail to account for the psychological, the social, the institutional constraints on action. And so again, we might think of Machiavelli as a good representative of this commitment. He distinguishes his own approach in The Prince from those who imagine republics and principalities that have never been known to exist. And so part of what he's saying here is like, let's get real. Let's not be talking in terms of imagined or idealized republics, where in thinking about them, we've relaxed all sorts of feasibility constraints, or we've made some idealized assumptions. You might think of Rawls, assuming full compliance, for instance. Machiavelli is saying, no, let's come up with a set of guidelines for the politics that we actually have. And so those are the four commitments: the distinctiveness of politics, the conflictual and contestatory nature of politics, the priority of order and stability over the demands of justice, and then this kind of what anti-utopian or anti-moralistic set of commitments.
When you put it that way, it does really seem like apocalypticism is going to be a challenge for a realist to grapple and put their head around. Like almost like if you designed a belief that would jar awkwardly with what you just described, it would be that. I asked you for a definition of realism. Do you have one to start us with for apocalypticism? Because with the same proviso, right? Like it seems to cover quite a number of different things. I would make it, for me personally, I would make it inclusive of both political and religious apocalypses. Feel free to disagree with that, but do you have like a starting point for, I think you know it when you see it, but what core features you might identify that within?
Yes, if I start with the kind of definition I might offer at a party, I might say something like the REM song doesn't get it too wrong, that an apocalypse is the end of the world as we know it. We can move from there to a more scholarly definition, and so I'd put some meat on the bones of that and say that an apocalypse is an imminent, so it's coming soon. It's a cataclysmic. So it's the world will end in a bang, not a whisper, right? It's an imminent and cataclysmic end to the known world. And along with that, an end to some of those worldly evils. It's also a rupture in the apparent temporal continuity of history. And it's a rupture that reveals something to us about our past and the meaning of that past, and announces a radically new future. So that's a mouthful, but we can break it down. So when people are thinking apocalyptically, they generally think that the end of the world is imminent or it's coming soon, with a certain variation about how we might define soon. And so you might just think here of the portrait of Jesus that we get in the Gospels, where, at least on some accounts, he expects the world to end in the lifetime of his listeners and his followers. So he's playing there with I shouldn't say playing, he's conveying there a concept of an imminent end. The end of the world will also be cataclysmic. And so we might think there of the account we get famously in the book of Revelation. It's an account of the divine consumption of the world and most of humanity. But it's an end in Revelation that also brings an end to some real or perceived worldly evils. And so for Christians, it's an end to sin. It's an end to suffering. We might think for contemporary apocalypticists who are concerned about the environment, they might put the focus on the apocalypse mean an end to humanity's sustained attack on our natural world. It's also, an apocalypse is ruptural. It's a break in the apparent temporal continuity of history. It's a break with the kind of historical unfolding that we know and that we're familiar with. It can't be conceived of or explained in terms of normal historical time. And finally, it's revelatory. And this is, of course, the literal meaning of apocalypse is revelation. There is something about this end that unveils, that discloses the meaning of our past and that reveals the shape of things to come.
One common theme I always draw, which picks up on what you just said, is a really profound dissatisfaction with the current prevailing orders of the world. As seeing of the existing social order as not just imperfect, but monstrous or deeply deprived in some form, and also false in some form, such that as you say, the destruction of it is revelatory. The destruction of it is truth-bringing. That's certainly in Christianity. We see now darkly as through a glass, then we will see perfectly.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think the intuition can be vindicated by contextualizing the circumstances in which the book of Revelation was written. It is a vision that comes to John of Patmos, who is someone who's been living under Roman imperial rule. And it doesn't take a lot of decoding to realize that there's a stark critique of imperial rule that runs through the book of Revelation. The whore of Babylon, for instance, stands in for Rome, stands in for a fallen and corrupt order. And it's a very understandable vision for people to have, even a hopeful vision for those subject to forms of oppressive order, that there will be a day, and it will come soon, when that corrupt order will come to an end, where a world that is out of joint will be set right. And all of those who've been suffering under these egregious political orders will be saved.
In that line, you had, because it's interesting though, because the New Testament throughout, I would read as a thoroughly apocalyptic. Every author there, in some sense, almost every author is convinced by apocalypticism in some form or another, but they take it in quite different directions, and Revelation is probably the most viscerally anti-Roman. You had an interesting take on Paul, which is I might read Paul a bit differently, but you took Paul as to be in many ways in some ways like reinterpreting and toning down the apocalypticism of Christianity, defanging it of its most overtly political consequences.
I think that's right. I read in especially 1st and 2nd Thessalonians a wrestling with apocalyptic thinking. And so in 1st Thessalonians, we get Paul experimenting with it, with that very familiar Christian apocalyptic vision, warning the Thessalonians that the end of the world is coming. And what we also see is that causes some problems. If you think the end of the world is near, you, for instance, might consider not working anymore. An imminent end of the world changes people's calculations about what is important or valuable to do right now. And so in 2nd Thessalonians, and I should add for the biblical scholars out there, I think it's been pretty well established to the extent one reads the Bible as a historical document, that 2nd Thessalonians is not written by Paul. It's written by some sort of pseudo-Paul. But for the purposes of the biblical tradition, let's say these are both Pauline texts. 2nd Thessalonians wrestles with the outcome caused by 1st Thessalonians, which is there's disorder in the community, people have given up working, etc. And so 2nd Thessalonians is really this effort to calm everyone down and get them back committed to their worldly life by saying, look, even if the end of the world is coming, we don't know when it's going to come. It will come like a thief in the night. And so the best thing you can do is sort of settle down and get back to your worldly life. And so I see in that Pauline tradition an anticipation of some of what the thinkers that I deal with in the book, these thinkers I call political realists, Machiavelli, Hobbes, a 20th century thinker, Hans Morgenthau. I see in those Pauline texts an anticipation of that struggle. On the one hand, there's something very appealing about apocalyptic thinking, and as you say, especially appealing for someone sitting at the heart of the Christian tradition, like Paul. And at the same time, there's a recognition of where apocalyptic thinking can go really wrong and cause some problems of worldly disorder that require management.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, and I'm glad you made the distinction with first and second, because I think second definitely has a different vibe to it. Let me try out a slightly different interpretation on you, and feel free to disagree. I read authentic Paul, so the 7 authentic letters, as certainly apocalyptic. I think he definitely thinks the world is actually going to end. It's not an abstraction or a metaphor. But it's just taken in a different direction. I think political apocalypticism can be disruptive and it can be threatening to power, as we see in Revelation. It can also tend in quite a politically quietist direction. It can tend in a sort of, if the end is coming and it's inevitable, we don't need to worry about all this oppression. That's going to get taken care of by itself. And you can see something by analogy similar in some modern forms of apocalypticism. So arguably you could say orthodox Marxism is politically apocalyptic in that it imagines a coming revolution. And you'd think that would be threatening to power, but in some instances it isn't. There's a long tradition of Marxists being quite skeptical of and hostile to unions, because they think, well, if we have unions, that will prop up the working class and prop up capitalism. And what we actually want is to accelerate the contradictions and get to the good stuff, as it were. And so weirdly, that apocalypticism, in many ways, leads to an outcome that is quite acquiescent to real world power. And I sort of read Paul as doing something similar there. He's like, I'm not saying I love Rome. Certainly don't love Greco-Roman morality, but we don't need to worry about it. We need to worry on us being in a state such that when this all comes, we're the ones who will be raised. Now, that's my read.
I don't object to that reading, and I really think where the apocalypticism gets a bit unmanageable in the Pauline tradition is really restricted to First Thessalonians, and then dealing with it with pseudo Paul and Second Thessalonians. But I think what you're putting your finger on is both a very reasonable reading of Paul, but it also highlights a tension within the Judeo-Christian tradition, because we've got a foundational apocalypse in the Hebrew Bible too, in the book of Daniel. And so if we take Daniel and Revelation, we see that tension that you're mentioning. On the one hand, there is a very quietist reading of the end of the world, and you see hints of it in both books. This suggestion to believers, like, this is not for you to bring about, and even perhaps this is not the battles of the end times are not for you to fight. Your job is to sort of sit tight and let this play out. And we see that quietist element of the apocalyptic tradition deployed again and again throughout history. And so in early modern England, where you get the rise after the Reformation of a kind of Protestant apocalypticism, this is often the sort of message from leaders. I'm thinking of Elizabeth I, James I, who who deploy these kinds of apocalyptic ideas to rally their people, for instance, to rally them against the Spanish Antichrist, which is for geopolitical reasons extremely helpful. But at the same time, they are conscious of the potential, the revolutionary potential of these ideas. So they put their emphasis on that quietist element. You know, it's not, this is not a battle for you to fight. For heaven's sake, calm down. And your job is to be good Christians and to wait for these great happenings. At the same time, we might say right in the heart, both of Daniel and Revelation, though, are a series of very captivating, provocative images of the end of the world. And you can't help but think that the psychological effect of what's being described there sort of fights against that quietist impulse, right? Especially for a people who might see themselves as on the losing end of a current worldly order, right? It's natural to think, well, if the world is going to be set right, can we not hurry this along? Can we not be committed participants in the end times? And so I think there is a question about agency and whose job it is, as it were, to bring about the end times.
Yes.
Is it solely God's job, or do we have a role to play as well? And that tension between who the agents of apocalypse are, I think that tension sits right in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and it's one that has to be wrestled with whenever apocalyptic ideas are deployed politically.
Yes, and it's something that sits very much within Western secular ideologies that emerge within the same traditions. Is they have to wrestle with the same thing. What's our place in all of this? Is it that the deterministic laws of history are going to produce this final reckoning, or do we have to do something about that?
That's right. You drew an interesting parallel to Marxism, which for some interpreters, it has the structure of an apocalyptic worldview. History has been progressing through certain stages. We are now in the stage of capitalism, or late capitalism, which I always think is a very hopeful way of putting it. We are in the stage of late capitalism, and there is going to be a rupture, and the revolution that comes is really going to be an end to historical time as we currently understand it. And there's a debate right there in the Marxist tradition about agency, right? Mm-hmm. Is it going to be? Is this going to be an outcome determined entirely by the laws of history? Or is there going to be room for human agency, particularly through class struggle? And so, as any undergraduate student reading Marx likes to ask, if all of this is determined by the laws of history, then why do you write the manifesto? But obviously that's sort of a pretty easy question to ask, though I think a natural one. But it's pulling on that very familiar tension about agency, that is a tension that's right at home in the Judeo-Christian apocalyptic tradition.
So here's my question, and this is a genuine question. It's something I've thought about, and I don't have a particularly good answer to. How distinctively Western, as a possible result of Christianity, is this? Because one thing I got from reading your book is, I know I'm not a historian, I know a tiny bit, and as Machiavelli, I was like, oh yeah, no, they were definite apocalypticists in his day, Savonarola and all that. Hobbes, I'm thinking the English Civil War, and it's like everyone in that was so religious, and it wasn't just some cynical affectation. We in our more secular age would recognise them as religious fanatics, right? Everyone, not just like a few people on street corners, all of the key decision makers. And it made me think, but you could, so certainly Machiavelli and Hobbes are wrestling with apocalypticism. You could probably say the same about just about anyone in the canon up to the early modern period. Like, this has just always been a thing in Western history. And even as organized religion seems to be at something of a low ebb, at least in Europe, there still seems to be secular equivalence of it as an aftershock. Is this because we stand in a tradition that puts the book of Revelation as a holy book? Or is it just something human that we're just attracted to that language and this is just a very captivating metaphor that we keep returning to? And like I say, I don't know. That's a question I wonder about.
Yes, so there are scholars of apocalypticism who have found variants of apocalyptic thinking in other religious traditions. The easiest case might be, for instance, the Shia Islamic tradition, which does have sort of certain set of messianic expectations.
You could say that's Abrahamic and that like this is contested, but it's drawing from Christianity and Islam in some sense. It's still downstream of that.
Yes, you could say that. There are also instances of there are certainly instances where some of those, let's say, Abrahamic ideas have blended with ideas from outside of those traditions. The group of Japanese believers who released poisoned gas, sarin gas, on the Tokyo subway system had an interesting fusion set of beliefs that combined some elements of traditional Japanese thinking with some of these more Judeo-Christian elements. And so it's certainly the case that that these ideas can be blended and repurposed with ideas very much outside the Judeo-Christian tradition. I think if you wanted someone to really make the case that you get some pretty developed apocalyptic visions from outside the Abrahamic faiths, you'd probably want to go to a comparative religion specialist. But I think from what I've seen, there are some intuitions that there are instances of this that are recognizable from that Judeo-Christian or even Abrahamic perspective that do not come from within that tradition. But I think that the elements of apocalyptic thinking that I mentioned, it's imminent, cataclysmic, the end to evil, the rupture in the apparent temporal continuity of history, a revelation, I think that is certainly strongest in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah, I'm talking from a position of quite extreme ignorance here, so listeners can correct me, but I believe in like the Maya tradition and the Aztec tradition, there are ideas of an end.
That's true.
But I don't. That is not an area I know about. But right, it's a bit of both. It does seem like these ideas are attractive across the board, but there is a specifically Judeo-Christian account of them that has shaped and perhaps added fuel to the fire of how we receive them in our tradition. Something like it's a bit of both, maybe.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think if what we're interested in is how this shapes the thinking of some of the canonical Western political theorists, then of course the tradition to be looking at is certainly that Judeo-Christian tradition, because it's the one that shapes their lives and their worldview. So I feel very comfortable with that assertion. But like you, I stand open to a listener writing in and saying, there's something very, very interesting going on in a non-Western tradition that I'm less familiar with.
Yeah. Should we do one case study here? Because like you start with Machiavelli. Machiavelli's a fave of mine. I think that apocalypticism wouldn't be the first thing people go to when they think of him. But should we maybe start with some historical context? Do you want to briefly review who, for instance, Savonarola was and why that might be important to understanding our author here?
Yeah, so let me even back up from there and just say when we read Machiavelli, we encounter someone writing at a time when Italy was being torn apart by wars. Italy, as we now know it didn't exist as Italy in the same way then. Italy, a series of city-states and principalities, is being torn apart by wars. Florence, where Machiavelli himself lives, is dealing with certain domestic political crises that are coming at the end of 60 years of Medici rule, this banking family, patrons of the arts, etc., who rule rule Florence nominally as a republic, but effectively as a kind of hollowed out republic or a principality. And it's also a time, understandably, because of that international and domestic instability, it's a time when apocalyptic ideas are very attractive to Florentines. And there's been a history of it. And the person that Machiavelli is particularly interested in is the Dominican friar you mentioned, Girolamo Savonarola. And Savonarola rises to power as a preacher and subsequently as a political figure in the 1490s in the context of some of this instability, the crumbling of a Medici order. And Savonarola's genius, I think, lies in the way he uses apocalyptic rhetoric to make the worldly political crises of Florence make sense of them for his audience. And so in 1494, Florence is in a really delicate state, and to make matters worse, in come the French, who are trying to make good their claim on Naples, and they're coming through Florence, and they haven't arrived yet, but everyone knows they're coming. So there's this looming danger. And for Savonarola, what that means to him is that the French are a scourge from God. The Florentines have not been living right. You know, he says you've been licentious and corrupt, and you're partying, and you're engaging with prostitutes, and you're doing all the wrong things, and this is the punishment from God. And so his repeated phrase is, "Behold the sword of the Lord falling on the earth quickly and swiftly." He then gets himself into a bit of a difficult spot because he's been warning, as the French are coming, he's been warning Florence of a kind of apocalypse with no redemption. Like, this is really just the end, and the French are going to act as God's instrument. The problem is the French come, and it's all a bit tense for a bit. And strangely, though, it's Savonarola who is deployed to get them to move on and get out of Florence and go on to Naples. And he is effective in doing that. He's effective in doing it in part because he goes and tells the French king, "Look, you, sir, are on an apocalyptic mission of your own, and there's prophecies about this, and get on to Naples and fulfill the prophecy." And so the French leave, and Florence is spared. And you might think, what a pickle for Savonarola. I mean, he seems to be the prophet who's been disconfirmed. He warned of this scourge, but they can't come, and they've left, and Florence is still Florence. But his genius is to still repurpose that outcome in apocalyptic terms. So then he says to Florence, well, this is just proof of God's favor for us, and that we will be the site of a new Jerusalem. The apocalypse is still coming, but we have time to get right with God, give up your licentious ways, throw all your vanities into the bonfires, and Florence will be the site of an apocalyptic rebirth, the heaven on earth described in the book of Revelation. And so that's Savonarola, and he parlays that popular apocalyptic message into playing an initially very big role in a short-lived Florentine republic that emerges after the Medici rule has crumbled. And Machiavelli also plays a role in that government. So the two are very much intertwined in the 1490s in Florence.
It's such an interesting period because you have so many, like, quote unquote, big names all in one city at one time. It's just one of the really fun bits of history. I mean, in Savonarola's defense, and he's not a historical figure I find hugely sympathetic, but that sort of quick about face, that's a vision of apocalyptic prophecy that would be part of like the older Hebrew Bible. Like Daniel is towards the end, that's in the Maccabean period. But when you get the sort of, Assyrian period, what apocalyptic prophets aren't doing is foretelling something hundreds of years from now. Or no, it's the Assyrian army's coming, and
Yes.
what do we do about that? Well, God wants us to trust and believe, and if we do that, they won't destroy Jerusalem, but if they do, they won't. It's a much more immediate form of prophecy. It's what is God wanting us to do to get out of this immediate foreign policy crisis? And the outcome is contingent on what we do. That's sort of the deep roots of the Christian prophetic tradition. By the time you get towards the tail end of the Old Testament period and into the New Testament one, you get this much more total picture of all things coming down. But I guess maybe Savonarola could say, no, I'm like Isaiah and so on. That's what I was doing. But I don't know.
He certainly sees himself in that tradition, and will cite some of those prophetic figures that clearly inspire him. But I think that when he talks about the end of the world, when he talks about Florence as a new Jerusalem, that is very much Book of Revelation material. But I mean, I wouldn't want to live under a government run by Savonarola, but I have a lot of admiration for his genius in crafting these kind of prophetic and apocalyptic messages. I think in the same way you've expressed it. I think he shows himself to be able to harness both the most compelling aspects of Old Testament or Hebrew Bible prophecy, and then wed that to everything that is appealing and motivating and captivating about a Book of Revelation style account of the end of the world.
And one thing to move to Machiavelli, one thing that's interesting with Machiavelli is I think people start with a view of him as a scientific, meaning sort of purely logical, rational, and secular thinker, which would imply he has a very negative view of Savonarola. And in fact, there's a sort of, you say this in your book, but I've said this earlier, there's a real ambiguity to Machiavelli's account of Savonarola. You can catch him saying negative things. There is also an admiration there, I think. Machiavelli likes people who succeed, and Savonarola clearly has what Weber would call charismatic authority, right? And also Machiavelli isn't secular. I mean, feel free to give me your take. I read Machiavelli as religious, sometimes flippantly religious. Sometimes he'll make jokes about it. But there's a supernaturalist bent to Machiavelli at times. He does believe in prophecy. He does believe in signs and omens. It's not central to his political thinking, but he's not a modern chess player. That's not who this guy is. That's an image we've imposed on him.
Yes, so let's start with his view of Savonarola. I do think it's not clear to me that he had an entirely negative view of Savonarola, and that's in part for the reasons you suggest. He recognizes a certain genius in Savonarola as a political actor, able to command obedience and belief from his followers, and scholars who have tended to think Machiavelli has a negative view of Savonarola sometimes rest that case on evidence that might, within the world of Machiavelli, be a bit ambiguous. So, for instance, Machiavelli, when he's working for the Florentine Republic, is deployed in the late 1490s to go listen to some of Savonarola's speeches and then report back on them. And And he says, okay, well, he says one thing one day, and by the next day he's completely changed his story. And Machiavelli says he sort of colors his lies to suit the times. And so some interpreters say on the basis of this, well, that's a sort of contemptuous remark. But then we think, well, what does Machiavelli say in The Prince about people who change what they say to suit the times? He says, well, that's fantastic. They're adaptable. That's a kind of Machiavellian virtue, right? Is to be able to adapt one's behavior to suit the times. A kind of moral and strategic flexibility is something he values. And so I think we do have to read his evaluations of Savonarola in light of what we know Machiavelli valued and esteemed. And I think once you do that, the picture of his view of Savonarola becomes much more interesting and potentially positive. It opens the door to a much more positive evaluation of Savonarola. As for Machiavelli's relationship to Christianity, I think it's complex for the reasons you suggest. I don't think it's clear that he's a kind of what we would call today a kind of contemporary amoral strategist or irreligious strategist. I tend to think as a matter of interpretation that we can get ourselves tied in knots and going down blind alleys if we obsess about the innermost religious beliefs of thinkers in the early modern canon, in part because the circumstances were not such that had they been atheists, they could have really declared it openly, right? And so all we have to go on is what people said on the page, in the late 15th century, or in Hobbes's case in the 17th century. And that's not always the best indication of what they believed in the depths of their soul. But what they say on the page tells us a lot. And certainly whatever Machiavelli's beliefs are, he takes religion seriously. He takes it seriously as a force that can bind people together and to get them to make exceptional sacrifices. He sees it as a force that can be cunningly deployed by political actors to get people, for instance, to go to war and defend their state. And so he certainly sees that religion has important political functions, and he praises people who are able to deploy it in that way. I think that's part of the admiration for Savonarola. And in the discourses on Livy, it's part of the admiration he has for Numa as almost a second founder of Rome. I mean, Romulus gives Rome its political founding, but for Machiavelli, Numa gives it its civil religion. And that civil religion is going to prove very important for getting Romans to fight for Rome. And so Machiavelli really admires these figures of history, of myth and legend who are able to put religion to use in that way. And when he chastises Christians or the Christianity of his time, I don't think we should read that as a rejection of Christianity as such. I think what it's a rejection of is a particular kind of Christianity that is encouraging believers to be meek, to await true salvation in an afterlife, to not invest in the life of this world because the real action is in the next world. And Machiavelli thinks that sort of quietist, accommodationist reading of Christianity is not doing anyone any favors. And so you can see some anticipation there of some points that will be taken in even more radical directions by later thinkers like Nietzsche. But that's what Machiavelli is worried about, is a kind of Christianity that orients us away from this world and the things we build together in this world, the orders, the political orders that we build, that we sustain, that we fight for. You're never, as Machiavelli thinks, going to achieve any kind of lasting glory. You're never going to achieve a kind of secular immortality in this world if everyone is always oriented toward heaven and the New Jerusalem.
You read him as having, or at least borrowing, rhetoric from the apocalyptic tradition, specifically in the last chapter of The Prince, the exhortation to free Italy from the barbarians. I feel like this is a chapter that kind of throws everyone. There's as many can you explain that for us? What's going on? Because it does seem thematically and tonally discordant with the rest of the work. What's happening in the last chapter of The Prince?
That's right. That was my reaction to it the first time I read it. It's my students' reaction when I teach The Prince year after year is the experience of reading The Prince, especially when you're reading it for the first or second time, is that you have 24 chapters of a kind of pragmatic manual of statecraft, and then the final chapter. Sorry, I should say 25 chapters of a pragmatic manual of statecraft. And then in chapter 26, the final chapter, it seems to come out of nowhere. I mean, you've been reading in the rest of the book sort of general rules that ought to be followed. It's better to be feared than loved, etc. And you get to the final chapter, and it is overtly an exhortation. It's an exhortation to save Italy from the barbarians. God is mentioned far more in that final chapter than in the previous 25 chapters. And the language is religious language. I mean, think about what Machiavelli says in that chapter. He says Italy is more enslaved than the Hebrews, more servile than the Persians, more dispersed than the Athenians, without a head, without order, beaten, despoiled, torn, pillaged, and having endured ruin of every sort. That sort of language would be very much at home in the prophetic tradition. And so what is it doing there? As you said, this is so puzzling to interpreters of Machiavelli. And there's some very interesting interpretations of the final chapter. I mean, some people think he just can't be serious. Other people think that the whole it's a clue to the purpose of the whole book, which is to trap the Medici into making fatal errors that will undermine their rule. Because at the time Machiavelli writes The Prince, the Medici have come marching back into power, and it's very reasonable to read the book in light of that. I think something else may be going on, and that's that Machiavelli in the rest of the book has tried to make the apparent contingency of political events in Italy and in Florence, has tried to make it intelligible by understanding it with general rules. And one of the things he finds, and again, this is something, always listen to one's students, because they're often, as first readers of a text, notice things that we've stopped noticing. But what students will say is, well, he starts these chapters with general rules, but then as the chapter progresses, the rules have to be qualified. You know, it's better to be feared than to be loved, but of course, you don't want to be hated. And then there are certain situations in which, he has to qualify the rule further. And so he's struggling to make politics intelligible and subject to human mastery with this by applying general rules. He takes a second stab at it, I think, in the chapters, I'm thinking especially of chapters 24 and 25, dealing with fortune. So if you can't make politics intelligible through general rules and laws, how about trying to kind of understand the nature of political variation itself? We might say that's one way of thinking about what he's doing with fortune. And there, it's not general rules and laws that he's relying on, it's metaphors. So how do we understand fortune? How do we understand that, seemingly incomprehensible variability of politics? Well, maybe fortune is like a river, in which case what we have to do is when the river is calm, we have to prepare for the times when it's going to flood and overrun its boundaries. That implies that what you want in a ruler, someone who can master the world of politics, is someone with kind of caution and foresight. You want the dam builder kind of ruler. But then he takes another stab at fortune, and we get the enduring and, probably one of the most enduring misogynistic images in all of Western political thought, that fortune is a woman who has to be beaten down and mastered. And that suggests that what you want out of a political ruler is boldness, risk-taking, violence. There's unambiguous hints of violence there. And so I'm not sure if in the end, there might be ways of resolving those two metaphors. Machiavelli also entertains the possibility that maybe the best character traits for dealing with fortune are just pure adaptability. You want a ruler that can just kind of roll with the punches. And it seems like he's got one, a historical example that might give us all hope that kind of adaptability is possible. And it's the example of Pope Julius. I forget which number Julius he is, but it's a Pope Julius. And he says, Pope Julius, his behavior was always suited to the times. But then what he admits is, but that's not because he was super adaptable. It's just Julius was bold when times called for boldness, and he was just lucky enough to die before times changed and called for caution. And so I think there we get the thought, maybe actually that kind of ability to move with the times is a kind of superhuman capacity, and it's beyond most of us to be able to do it. We're kind of cautious people, or we're bold people, or we're some other kind of person, and it may or may not suit the times. And so if you read The Prince that way, as this genuine attempt on Machiavelli's part to wrestle with the apparent contingency of history and politics, to make it intelligible, to make it subject to mastery, and that has been a struggle. By chapter 25, we've got some genuine questions. Then I think it makes sense to read the final chapter as a very different way to come to grips with the apparent contingency of politics, which is to give it meaning in an apocalyptic narrative, and to promise that it'll come to an end. And so what kind of meaning is given to Italy's suffering? The meaning that's given to it, that Italy is, more enslaved than the Hebrews, more servile than the Persians, etc., is that all of the troubles in Italy, all of the wars, all of the domestic unrest are a prelude to some kind of redemption. That Italy will be redeemed at the hands of a very remarkable leader. And that leader will, and I think this is remarkable for Machiavelli, will be greeted by the people with tears and with love. Given everything Machiavelli has told us about human nature, that signals that this is a very extraordinary person indeed. And so I think that is a way of reading chapter 26 that shares something with some of the structure of apocalyptic prophecy that we saw in Savonarola. And I don't think that should be surprising to us, given that, as we were talking about before, there was so much that Machiavelli admired about Savonarola. And Machiavelli saw firsthand how those kinds of apocalyptic narratives could command belief.
But you see that as sort of a momentary bit of optimism from him, and the discourses takes a more somber view of the trajectory of human affairs.
I think that's right. I think by the time Machiavelli writes the discourses, he is more clear-eyed about some of the dangers of the kind of redemptive leader he seems to hope for at the end of The Prince. And so the figure of the redemptive leader comes up in the discourses on Livy, which in so many ways is a very different book. I think plausibly a much fairer reflection of Machiavelli's own Republican politics. And there the figure of the redemptive leader comes up in the context of a situation in which a republic has succumbed to corruption. And the question is what to do to bring it out of corruption, to bring it back to its more virtuous beginnings. And Machiavelli says, well, you can hope for a kind of redemptive leader who's able to do this, a very extraordinary man. And he means extraordinary in a quite literal sense, someone who's willing to act outside the orders. Which has in Italian, I think the word carries the connotation of extra legal. So someone who can act beyond the established orders. And Machiavelli says that can happen, but it rarely happens without tremendous bloodshed and destruction. And even if you've got yourself a fairly good redemptive leader, there are also very pragmatic questions about what comes next and who succeeds him. And so there, I think you get a much more kind of nuanced worldly skepticism about that hope for a redemptive founder or redemptive refounder, and a lot more emphasis placed on the kind of ordinary institutions and practices of politics.
Yeah, there's also running through the discourses this sort of like cyclical idea. It starts with the sort of theory of states going always, monarchy will decay into tyranny and so on and so forth, that's just classical. I think that's from Polybius. But, I don't know how much attention he honestly pays to that after he puts it in. But there's this idea of rise and fall, the wheel of fortune, that, yes, you might get someone who rises and builds up, but that will in turn decay. And yes, there was this great empire that was Rome, but it fell. And the fleetingness and intransigence of human affairs, I think, is a theme in the discourses as well. Whereas you could argue that perhaps The Prince ends on a bit more of an optimistic note with just the rise, and it doesn't deal with so much the impermanence of that.
I think that's right. Although I've always found a strange kind of optimism in that worldly perspective of the discourses. Like, look, this is just the business of this world and of politics, that worldly orders rise and decline, sometimes die. And yet the world does not come to an end, right?
Yeah. Go on.
So you can look at history, and one of the messages you can take from it is we've been through worse. And maybe we should interpret what's going on. If one lives in a present where one thinks that maybe this is the end of everything. And I'm speaking to you from the United States right now. I'm sure there are a whole bunch of Democrats and progressives who may be inclined to that thought right at the moment. There can be something heartening about the kind of long historical vision Machiavelli has in the discourses, that it simply just is the case that worldly orders, including orders as kind of strong and world straddling as Rome, come to an end, and the world does not end with them. That the end of worldly orders can bring immense destruction, destabilization. In the case of the fall of Rome, massive refugee flows, destruction of human life, and yet the world persists. And I think there's a kind of dark optimism about that more tragic perspective on world history.
I love that, yeah. So that really vibes with me. That's to a degree how I see things. And like perhaps what might separate me from other people who are in my political camp is just that different vision of the world. It's both, yes, the world goes on. I think it's also an acceptance of change, an acceptance of difference. You know, I think, let me read you back to you. I made a note of this in the conclusion of your book. You write, the apocalyptic imagery holds the seductive promise that difference, disagreement, and conflict can be eliminated. I think that's core to, dropped in it. That's core to the apocalyptic vision, is that politics can somehow end itself. That change and disagreement, that it will all be over, and perhaps over soon. And my, what would you call this, sort of social ontology, if that's the right, my just framing of the world, is that there are periods of stability and there are periods of consensus, and then they fall apart again. There are periods of good times and periods of bad times. There's no liberal arc of history that we're always on an upwards ascent. We might not be. There's equally not some revolutionary moment coming. But that isn't this awful, terrible thought that people imagine it to be. It can be. Things can go badly wrong. You mentioned the US. They might. Like, bad outcomes are on the table. I'm not like, it's not a dismissive thought. Things can go very, very wrong indeed. But at the same time, the idea that there will always be disagreement, that we'll never resolve at a conceptual level what something like freedom or justice means, and at a practical level what the exact priorities that a state should pursue are, shouldn't be this terrifying thing. That is just the condition we find ourselves in. And we can either grapple with it or we can't. But that's almost just like the first step of a mature politics, is we are, that politics is permanent, that it's not going away.
Yes, I think that's right, and that's the vision of politics that I think is reflected in Machiavelli's later writings. It's a vision of politics that I think runs deep within the political realist tradition. But it's a vision of politics that's sometimes hard to accept. I mean, it's a vision of, yes, the inescapability of conflict and disagreement. It's a vision of a political world that rarely rewards virtuous intentions. It's a vision of a political world that for some people doesn't offer much hope. Though I would say having this more, what the realists would call realistic, I might also call it tragic, perspective on political life, doesn't have to be inconsistent with the claim that we can improve our conditions. And
I really don't think it is.
Yes, and I think so. I think you could have a very tragic view of politics, but think, if I could use the terms my empirical colleagues might put it in, you might think the trend line of human progress is still kind of aiming upward. Like it is unambiguously progress to, for instance, end slavery, etc. That so many fewer people now die of preventable diseases than they used to. You can, whether you're a Steven Pinker type or whether you're just, you read your history type, you could think, well, no, we are moving in good directions. There are some instances of unambiguous progress, but we're getting a lot of variation around the trend line, right? So even if it is the case, to put it in Martin Luther King's terms, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, it is a bumpy road. And I think the tragic perspective is consistent with that. So I think you can have that tragic worldly perspective, but it doesn't commit you to the view that nothing ever gets better.
No, that's exactly where I'm at. I'm like 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the realist tradition. I think politics is eternal. I think it's not going anywhere. Disagreement isn't going anywhere. I don't think that commits you to an amoral perspective or a morally relativist perspective. I don't think you have to say because we're always going to disagree that there aren't better and worse ideas, because there's always going to be disputes that there's not better and worse outcomes. Those thoughts sit together quite neatly in my head. I think what I struggle with is that's not a narrative that sits comfortably, and it's not necessarily a narrative that is persuasive in the reality of the world. You outline, and perhaps with reference to Machiavelli, or perhaps just in general, two responses of the realist when confronted by the apocalypticist. One is tragedy, and the other, you called it redirection. Do you maybe want to talk a bit about that, because that, to close with, because that resonated with me a lot?
Yes. So we could see Machiavelli, by the time he gets to the discourses, at least on my reading, has adopted that first strategy. So we might think of that as it's a rejection of apocalyptic thinking. And that rejection often comes in the form of embracing a kind of more tragic worldview. The second thing that political realists have done, at least on my account, when encountered with the apocalypse, is to use it. And that's the strategy I call redirection. And I think we have an example of this. The best examples of this are in the two other thinkers I deal with in the book, Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, and Hans Morgenthau, writing in the later 20th century, mid to late 20th century. And I think what happens there, and I'll just use maybe Hobbes as a brief example here. He looks around in a similar way to Machiavelli. He sees a lot of people deploying apocalyptic narratives in his own time, and he sort of harnesses that for his own use. And we see him do that in his religious arguments. He takes a bunch of the features of the apocalyptic worldview as given, but then argues from within that tradition in ways that are meant to kind of calm people down and keep them from the extremes of apocalyptic thinking. And so he'll say things like, look, yes, the end of the world is happening, but it's not imminent. He resorts to that kind of Pauline language. It'll come as a thief in the night. So this is not something to be looming over you as you engage in all your worldly activities. And I also suggest in the book there are ways even to read Hobbes's more secular philosophical argument as partaking in some of the structure of an apocalyptic narrative. You know, the war of all against all and the state of nature is but a prelude to a kind of stabilizing order in the hands of the Leviathan state. And I think he's making use of some of that kind of structure of an apocalyptic narrative and some of the features of apocalyptic imagery to try and persuade people into accepting a virtually absolute Leviathan state. And so I would say that's an example of redirection, a kind of canny and strategic use of apocalyptic thinking, but in this case, to secure the ends, in Hobbes's eyes, of worldly peace and order. And so those are the two options, and I think they both come with promises and pitfalls. I mean, we've talked about all of the appeal of the apocalyptic imaginary. People are drawn to it. But there's some worry about what happens when you deploy it, and whether you can remain fully in control of all of the effects that apocalyptic thinking can have on people. One interesting worry that we haven't talked about, although it relates to the point you made earlier about quietism, is something a debate we see today about the use of apocalyptic rhetoric in the climate change debate. And so you see a lot of it there, some of it overtly biblical. I mean, Al Gore, to harken back to the early 2000s, talked about scenes of climate change related floods, storms, fires as, quote, like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. And other people use more secular examples. But one of the worries about using apocalyptic imagery there is that it can have a paralyzing effect on people. If people think there's an end coming and it's so big that I have very little agency as an individual to help stop this, I might as well just accept it. I might as well hunker down and kind of ride this out. So there's a danger of paralysis, I think, with the apocalyptic imaginary. But think about that tragic vision of politics that you're pulled to, and I certainly have a lot of sympathy with as well. As you suggested, it's a hard vision to get people to accept, right? It's not.
I don't think you can. I've sort of. This is sort of where I've landed with this. It's not a reason or an intelligence or here are my facts type thing. This is just foundational ways of seeing the world type thing.
Yeah.
And you can maybe sell someone on a specific policy. I don't think, to some degree, I think there are orientations that people have politically that you're kind of just not going to talk them out of, I think.
Yes, I think that's right, but I also think I look at that tragic perspective, and I always call to mind that phrase from Weber: "Politics is the boring through hard boards."
Yeah,
long boring through hard boards, and that's not a way to sell someone on politics. We might say that's not a captivating vision. Whereas apocalyptic thinking offers something immensely captivating. And what does the tragic worldview have to say to people? It says, well, look, the world, you just have to come to grips with the fact that we live in a world that's resistant to our mastery, that's unresponsive to our virtuous intentions, and that's really capricious in its rewards for goodness. And that is just a hard pill to swallow.
I wouldn't put it in terms exactly as negative as that, but that does seem to characterize the world a bit more accurately than an apocalyptic vision. I mean, yes, I think one of the things that if never even mind realist, if you just have a pragmatic bent of mind, apocalypticism is going to be a hard thing to grapple with, because I think pragmatic political actors, the borers of holes, tend to operate on a cynical worldview that every man has their price. And sometimes people don't. There is such a thing as just purely ideological opposition. But even that you can sort of wrap your head around. Okay, this person says they'll never break an oath. Fine. This person has this religious commitment. Fine. It's at least a constraint I can. This person thinks the entire social order is going to end, and then this thing. What do you even do with that? I think there's a quote that talking about art is like dancing about architecture, that this is just such fundamentally different mental modes and behaviors that they're almost inevitably going to talk past each other. I sort of think that's the same with a pragmatic view and apocalyptic one. These are just such different modes of thinking about the world. It is difficult for the realist to talk to the apocalypticist. They're just speaking very different languages.
Yes, and we can think very practically about what has happened. The United States has its share of contemporary apocalyptic movements. And when I was working on the dissertation that would eventually turn into this book, we had one. We had a movement that was preparing for an apocalypse that they thought would happen in May of 2012, as I recall. I may have the specific date wrong, but it was but some of the people in that movement had emptied their savings accounts, emptied their children's college funds.
I remember this, yeah.
Given away many of their worldly possessions. And so people do very concrete things on the expectation that the world is ending, and that can be a worry. And there's also Thomas Hobbes's worry that is, as you suggest, if you think the end of the world is imminent and that all our worldly orders and our state and all of its institutional apparatus are going to be annihilated at the hand of God, people who believe that do not make obedient citizens.
Right.
And or in Hobbes's language, subjects. They can be very disruptive. But let's give, I think there's one area where I'd want to give that apocalyptic worldview its due in comparison to the more tragic perspective, which is the tragic perspective that, politics is in many ways inescapable, and that to some extent history is the same damn thing over and over again, even if we can admit some areas of improvement. That worldview finds it really hard to account for radical novelty. And so this was a problem that the last thinker discussed in the book, Hans Morgenthau, much more of an international relations theorist. He held something like the tragic worldview, and it took him a long time to grasp that nuclear weapons, and especially thermonuclear weapons, that the hydrogen bomb and its ilk, really were a radical change, not just to warfare, but they were a radical change to the nature of human existence and the possibilities of human existence. And I think it's reasonable to think that the tragic worldview held him back from recognizing that. He eventually did recognize that, and he at that point turns more to entertaining something like an apocalyptic worldview. And I think that, someone might say the same today about climate change, that this is really a radically novel threat. And to the extent you hold a tragic worldview, you may not be able to fully grasp that. So that's the one thing I'll say that my book suggests we should worry about the tragic worldview, both that it's a really hard worldview to hold because it doesn't offer much promise or consolation, but also that it sometimes seems ill-equipped to deal with radical novelty.
Let me give you mine, and then we should close because we're past an hour. But what I credit the apocalyptic worldview with is, in some ways, really, I'm sounding very negative in this interview, but in some ways really reckoning with how profoundly insane and unjust social orders can be. I think the apocalyptic worldview comes out of, in many ways, an instinctive reaction that there is something deeply wrong in the world. I think it's not an accident that, it comes out of the Babylonians and then the Seleucids conquering Jerusalem, and then you certainly don't want to be on the receiving end of Roman imperialism. But then an apocalypticism I've thought a lot about is a sort of socialisty apocalypticism, of which the Marxist version we talked about would be an extreme case. But there's a more mainstream one when, say, Bernie Sanders talks about the revolution. I don't think he's imagining Jesus coming on the clouds, but the language is still very evocative of a sudden, immediate change for the better, right? And I think many social people on that side of the political aisle are very, very motivated by that. And I think what gets them there is, I think they feel very profoundly, not just intellectually recognise, but really feel very profoundly the injustices of the world. I think when they talk about feeling distraught that people don't have health care or inequality or wars abroad, I don't think they're faking that. I think that concern is very, very real, and I think they experience the world, Marxist, not just as oppressive, but as kind of insane, as contradictory and monstrous. Marxists talk about the contradictions of capitalism, right? I think there is something a bit nuts about the world. There is something a bit nuts about the fact that you can be a respected member of a community in one instance, and then your card declines and you're looked at like you're an absolute piece of the next. There is something a bit mad about the way our reputations and status swing around. And I think the apocalypticists can say we are sort of experiencing that directly. And in a way, we're not intellectually dressing it up. Now, they go with that in places that I think can be quite harmful, but there's not nothing there, that would be mine.
I think that's right, and maybe it's appropriate for the end of our conversation to sort of circle back to the beginning, which is the book of Revelation, that book that sits at the end of the Christian Bible. It was fundamentally motivated by someone living under Roman imperial rule who thought that the world was out of joint. And he wasn't wrong. He saw something that was real, and thinking about it apocalyptically was a way to make sense of the reality he was experiencing. And I think that's part of the power of apocalypse is apocalyptic thinking tells the person who looks at their world and thinks there is something wrong here, it tells them you're right.
Yes.
We're not going to gaslight you and tell you there's nothing to see here. Like, we will acknowledge with all the kind of force and imagery of the apocalyptic tradition that you are right. Something is desperately wrong here. And I think that makes sense, too, of why the apocalyptic imaginary has such appeal for people throughout time living in conditions of oppression. And so you see, for instance, in certain narratives or retellings of the lives of people living under slavery in the United States, that the apocalyptic worldview had immense appeal for them. And you can see why, not just that it promised an end to their extraordinary suffering, but also it told them that what you're seeing and what you are living and what you are experiencing is not right. There's something that's gone profoundly wrong here. And it's not going to exist forever. And part of the reason it's not going to exist forever is because it is so wrong.
Yeah.
And I think it's no accident that the song that became most associated with the Union Army in the American Civil War is an apocalyptic song. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And the imagery of that song is not just an imagery of vindication and the stamping out of evil. It's an imagery that, for all the people fighting in that war, acknowledged that what they were confronting was a profound injustice. And it helped them to make sense of that. And it also helped to galvanize them to confront it. And I think that is, and to make, in many cases, extraordinary sacrifices to do so. And I think that is part of the power, and sometimes the power in the service of justice, of the apocalyptic imaginary.
Yes, and that is what can motivate people to be part of. I'll just go with my example of the socialist left. That is what draws people in. It is also what can make those movements difficult to talk to and at times counterproductive, is that same something is profoundly wrong. One of my political constants for the past 10 years is I take the threat of the far right, of Donald Trump and European equivalents, seriously. I don't think it's something that should be compromised with, and I think it's something that should be opposed at all points. That's just one of my core bedrocks. And I found that apocalypticism, political apocalypticism, can really get in the way of that. There was this idea in 2016 that, in Susan Sarandon's words, maybe Trump will bring the revolution, this kind of accelerationist idea that maybe things will get so bad that, and obviously that's not how the world works. And then there's more subtle forms of that, where you say, we need to protect the American constitutional order from this threat to it. And people's reaction is, look, I'm not saying I like Trump or anything, but when you say protect the American constitutional order, I don't want that. I don't want corporate centrism. Like, I don't want the mainline Democratic Party. I want the socialist utopia. I want the apocalypse. I don't want my political action to be in service of a status quo I find horrific.
Mm.
And in some ways, I empathize with the emotional direction they're coming from, but I find both of those responses unhelpful. And in my position, I'll close here, this is where I find myself sort of struggling between the two responses you outlined of what do you say to that person? Because you've got tragedy or redirection. You can kind of, on the one hand, redirect and say, yeah, we can get to the socialist thing. First, we've got to defeat Donald Trump, and then we've got to reform the Democratic Party. That story's long and it's confusing and it's impractical, and even when you do it, it doesn't satisfy people. We did get some progressive legislation out of Biden. That wasn't what people were after. At the same time, when people say, oh, but then how do we get to socialist utopia? If I'm being really, really honest, my response is we're not going to. There's moments in history when you can have radical progressive change. I don't think we're living through one. I think we're living through one where our realistic options are slog on with existing orders or do something different and darker. If you want me to be real, that's where I think we're at. But that's not going to inspire anybody. And I don't know. I find one more truthful and one more motivating, but with pitfalls built in. So, yeah.
I mean, that is in many ways a great summary of the two approaches outlined in the book, and why it can be so difficult to make a hard choice between them.
Yeah. Anyway, that's what I took away from your book. Let's end there. Any final words or any way you'd like to direct listeners? The book we've been discussing is a political realism in apocalyptic times. Any Twitter, Blue Sky website you'd like people to know about?
Oh, well, in this, I'm hesitant to, at this moment, direct people to Twitter. But how about I just direct them to my own personal website, and that is my name, Alison with one L, McQueen, McQueen, all one word, .info. And there people can find both my academic papers as well as some things I've written on apocalyptic thinking for a more contemporary audience as well.
Okay, awesome. Alison, I appreciated your book and thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation.